Okay, thank you for joining us, everyone, for Signs and Symbols, How Did We Get to Charlottesville? I'm Maya Hermerding from the McCarthy Center.
I'm Jaheer Jones from the BSA.
We're excited to have you all here tonight.
BSA, what's BSA?
Alright, cool.
Who's the tech person?
So, the Black Student Association is a group of students on campus who work to improve the condition of Black students on campus while creating relationships, better relationships with the whole campus at large. We're open to everyone. A lot of people think that because you're not Black, you can't be in the Black Student Association, but that's absolutely wrong. We're looking for everyone. We're looking to bridge gaps between people who would never really have anything to do with each other. So come out, look for our meetings, things like that.
Perfect. So tonight on our panel, we have Dr. Shannon Smith from the History Department, Quinton Johnson from also the History Department Student Voice, Jaheer, and Dr. Nash from the History Department as well. As you can see, we have it set up a little bit different tonight. We don't have our panel up front lecturing to you or trying to have a conversation with the audience. We invited you all to sit in the circle. If there are empty seats, please feel free to take them, join us. And if you're all outside of the circle, feel free to ask questions. Please participate. Just because you're not sitting at the tables doesn't mean you can't be part of the conversation. Okay, and with that, I'll let you guys take it away.
All right. Thanks, Maya. So I think what we're going to start with is we're going to allow the panelists to sort of remind everybody what happened in Charlottesville and then give a little context and why it's important what happened in Charlottesville.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Dr. Smith, Mr. Jones, Mr. Johnson for inviting me here. I also thank the McCarthy Center for hosting this event and providing us with an opportunity to reflect on the place of the past in the present. And thanks also to the McCarthy Center for encouraging conversations about race in a place that sometimes doesn't talk about race as much as maybe it should. And also I got much gratitude to the Black Student Association and the History Department for co-sponsoring this. So for me, what I thought I could do is just play a little bit and give you my perspective. And to let you know who I am, I came from the Northeast. I came from New York State. So I have really very little relationship with the South. I always thought when I was a kid that it was a backwater, but I've learned a little bit more about it. And I think I can appreciate it more now. And I studied the history of early America, so not necessarily the 19th century, but mostly the 17th century, the 18th century, and I'm also interested in the Caribbean during that time period. So hopefully that'll give you a sense of where I'm coming from. And some of the questions that I'm interested in is like, how past is the past, or is the past present in the present? And I think the past isn't necessarily past. It just seems like it's past because of our position in the present. Likewise, I see the past as a part of the present, like a true part of it every single day. And one of the ways that I sort of work through this is by intellectual influences. And one of my strongest influences is a 20th century writer named James Baldwin. And James Baldwin wrote an essay in 1966 called Unnameable Objects, Unspeakable Crimes. The essay was actually published in a shorter version in 1965 in an issue of Ebony magazine, and it was called The White Man's Guilt. And I think the essay is a great exploration of history. And I'll just quote for you some of my favorite spots. Baldwin writes in this essay, "For history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. So I think you can see sort of how that passage perhaps influenced me. But to give you a little bit more of Baldwin, Baldwin also talks about people who, in his mind, he felt as a black gay man, he was despised by history. So he found history to be propaganda, somewhat questionable, particularly master narrative of history. And then on the other hand, he talks about people who imagine that history flatters them. And in this case, he's talking about white folks. And he says that, of course, it will flatter them because they wrote it. And he compares them to butterflies that are impaled on a pin. You know, so if you ever go to a science building and you see these butterflies that are stuck on a pin, that's what he says white folks are like with their history, because they're incapable of seeing or changing themselves or their world. He's afraid that, he titles the essay The White Man's Guilt because he thinks that, you know, if white folks actually learn their history, they'll feel guilty or they'll feel hostile to people who are telling them the history. And so they're incapable of seeing. They don't want to change, and they don't want to change themselves, nor do they want to change their world. And perhaps when Baldwin's right, maybe white folks, some white folks, I can see where they're coming from because, you know, they lived in a culture of white supremacy. So then, though, I think these questions lead to, or Baldwin's quotes lead to another question about, like, what is history then? And in a way, Baldwin is trying to separate history from the past. So Baldwin's arguing, like many historians argue, that the past is not history, right? History is some interpretation of that past. Likewise, every single historian, in my mind, is framed by their own present context. So there's a philosopher named Walter Benjamin who would suggest that around all historical texts, there's an invisible ink. And that invisible ink is the historian and the world that the historian lives in. And so that leads me then to the point that I think the histories that I try to write and the histories that I enjoy writing are actually, and I enjoy reading, are actually the histories of the present. And so what we mean by that, you can go all sorts of ways, where there's a French philosopher named Michel Foucault who talks about a history of the present. Likewise, there's a literary scholar by the name of Saidiya Hartman who also writes about a history of the present. And what she's interested in is trying to explore the afterlife of slavery. And what she calls the afterlife of slavery in her words is the racialized violence that occurred in slavery, its presence in the present. And she sees this potentially through skewed life chances, limited access to health, education, premature death, incarceration. Along with incarceration, I was reading today that supposedly almost half of the black men in Florida can't vote because they can't vote after being convicted of a felony, so disenfranchisement and impoverishment. So what Hartman writes is she says that the history of the present strives to illuminate the intimacy of our experience with the lives of the dead, to write our now as if it is interrupted by this past, and to imagine a free state, not as the time before captivity or slavery, but rather as the anticipated future of this writing. So for me, Baldwin, Hartman, and other folks I mentioned, what they suggest is that those of us who study the past, I mean, we're doing that to understand the present, but then at the same time, if we can get our narratives to be the accepted narratives, we might in some way be able to shape the possibility of what the future might look like. So now I guess I'll jump into these monuments. There's a Civil War historian named David Blight. He wrote a book a long, long time ago called Race and Reunion, the Civil War in American Memory. And it's kind of useful because what Blight mentions is that there's three visions of history or of historical memory of the Civil War. He calls one a reconciliationist vision, which is pretty much this idea that, oh, this was a war between American brothers. So why don't we all reconcile? Let's get along. Then he says there's a white supremacist vision that portrays the war as not being caused by slavery, that slavery was a good thing for people of African descent. And this white supremacist vision lines itself with Jim Crow's segregation and promotes that. And then he notes a third vision, which he calls an emancipationist vision, which focuses on the emancipation of enslaved people and their possible rebirth into citizens or equal citizens. And at the same time, too, this emancipationist vision, according to Blight and according to many African Americans who participated in and tried to promote this vision in the late 19th century, early 20th century, mid 20th century, late 20th century, early 21st century, and so on, is the sense that perhaps the United States could be reborn. And maybe the United States one day will actually live up to the words on its beautiful documents. So in my opinion then, that these monuments that folks talk about, or this monument in Charlottesville, this statue of Robert E. Lee that was built in 1924, perhaps tells us more about 1924 than it does about the Civil War. And so in that time period, Blight argues that this is when the reconciliationist vision and the white supremacy vision are coming together. And one thing to note is that about 9 years before 1924 was 1915, which was the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. And at that time, too, you see one of the most popular movies that popped up at the time was D.W. Griffin's Birth of a Nation, not to be confused with the more recent Birth of a Nation. And what D.W. Griffin's Birth of a Nation did was, in some ways, it glorified slavery. It had extremely strong supporters, but at the same time, extremely strong protests. And then, too, at the same time, as Jim Reed mentioned yesterday, for those of you who were at that panel, you have the height, or almost the height, of the second Ku Klux Klan, which Professor Smith would know better than me, but has about 4 to 5 million people in it at that time. And 100 years ago, in 1917, a Ku Klux Klan pamphlet articulated the goals of the organization, and I'll quote for you. Its goals were supposedly to shield the sanctity of the home and the chastity of womanhood, to maintain white supremacy, to teach and faithfully inculcate a high spiritual philosophy through an exalted ritualism, and by a practical devotedness to conserve, protect, and maintain the distinctive institutions, rights, privileges, principles, and ideals of pure Americanism, where I think you can see the presence of that past perhaps in August in Charlottesville, potentially. Likewise, too, in this time you had in the late 1910s, early 1920s, you had white race riots around, in which white folks in Charlottesville, Charleston, South Carolina, Longview, Texas, Arizona, Norfolk, Chicago, Knoxville, Omaha, waged war against black folks in their areas. In addition, another form of warfare, I would think, or terrorism, was lynchings. Historians estimate that between about 1889 and 1918, at least 2,472 black men and 50 black women were lynched across the U.S. So, I mean, you have this legacy of racial violence when this statue was created. And people who count monuments claim that maybe there's around 700 of them nowadays, Confederate monuments. And the majority of them were built between the 1890s and 1920s, a time period that a historian named Erica Doss calls statue mania. But it's even broader than statues. You can talk about even highways. You got the Jefferson Davis Highway that's still around. So, as I said, from my perspective, when we look at these things, these statues, these schools, anything named after anyone, we should pay attention to when that payment occurred and what the purpose may have been. And then, too, to think through, like, context-wise, I'm thinking, like, why was the statue placed where it was placed? And that's the context I'm looking at, as opposed to putting little signs on the statues to contextualize them. But here we are now. 2015 was the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And I mean, y'all remember in some ways 2015 or around there. For me, it was the first time I ever heard of a movement called Black Lives Matter. It was at the same time too, you know, you have a litany of individuals who are black men, women, children who are murdered. You have in 2015 in Charleston a shooting at the Emmanuel AME Church. So I think, you know, in a way, what Hartman's getting at too, when she talks about the presence of the past or this afterlife of slavery, it is racialized violence that is continuing to the present day. So I guess where I'm at then is that perhaps the past isn't past, maybe it's literally present in all that we do. Perhaps we're swimming in its wake, maybe some of us are drowning in its wake. So I guess what that does then, I think each generation in my mind has a right to write their own histories or their own narratives. If we take it seriously that historians are part of the present and that historical interpretations change over time. And the reason, in my opinion, why they change is because they're serving different audiences. Like the history perhaps that some of us want today, it's different than the history that you might be reading that was written in the early 20th century. And it sure should be, because we live in a different world in some ways, but yet at the same time a somewhat similar world. So I guess what I'll sort of close with is that one of my favorite historians is Nathan Huggins. And Huggins writes in one of his essays about master narratives that perhaps our times are seeming to call for new myths in a revised master narrative which better inspires and reflects our true condition. So one of the things I'm sort of curious about would be, if we wanted to do that, what would that look like? If we don't want to do that, why not, right? What would we want to preserve from an existing master narrative? And some of the things that I've been thinking about is, what would this narrative look like? Would it be infused with an emancipationist vision? Would it be monuments for, say, like Denmark Vesey in Charleston, or Harriet Tubman, who's in Little Rock right now, or Nat Turner in Richmond, or say Jimmy from the Great Stonewall Uprising in 1739 in South Carolina? Or would it be for some of the freedom fighters who were aboard the Amistad, and they're already there in New Haven, Connecticut? And then too, how would these monuments be constructed in which they're not in the shadow of white folks and being critiqued as soon as they're created? Because Robert E. Lee statue wasn't subjected to intense criticism, and it wasn't compared to other things. How could we take actually black history seriously then and create these monuments that we can interpret not in relation to white folks, but in relation to the history of black Americans? And I think I'll end with that, so thanks.
Thanks so much. So I just want to ask one big question and then kind of move it to the audience for questions. Oh, yeah.
Yes, I will add a bit to that. I'm very sorry, I really had many images that I wanted to share with you, and I'm sorry that we cannot access them and all view them together. Many of you might have seen circulating in the wake of the events in Charlottesville a chart that showed when different monuments were created. And there's a giant spike from about 1900 to about the 1930s, and another big spike during the 1950s and 1960s. So I want to provide a little context about why were those monuments raised at that particular time. As Professor Nash suggested, monuments are raised for a specific purpose. They have a very specific social, often economic, political message. The place in which they are raised also can send a specific message, often to groups who live in that space. So I teach here in the history department. I teach primarily about the 19th century and into the 20th century. I teach a class on the Civil War, so if you want to spend a whole semester talking about this, come, let's do that. And then I also teach about gender as well. So one of the things that I care about getting across in my Civil War class, most of all, is dealing with this story that we so often tell as Americans. And I think especially people who are not from the South really want to latch onto this idea as though the Civil War was fought by the North, who was good because they wanted to end slavery, and the South, who was bad, wanted to preserve slavery. So absolutely, the Civil War was about slavery. We can talk about the states' rights argument if you want, but the Civil War was about slavery. But what we miss in telling this story is that the North was absolutely as complicit in the practice of slavery. The West was complicit in slavery. The entire nation was founded and rooted in slavery. So instead of telling the simple story as though the North fought to solve the South's problem and teach them a lesson, we can think about how as a nation, the whole nation was complicit in that. And I think statues like that of Robert E. Lee in Charleston derived out of the South's need to tell a different story, that they weren't the bad guys and that they weren't the only problem in the nation. So I think if the North would stop dwelling on this idea that they were the good guys who were anti-slavery, then we wouldn't have such a need for this sort of Southern justification, this heritage movement, this propagation of the Confederate flag as though they are the rebels or the true upholders of the Constitution. That this binary, this easy binary, is what is very messy for us. So just very briefly, I want us to think about commemorative time periods. Immediately after the war, nobody wanted to talk about it. They were in mourning at the time. So that's when a lot of cemeteries are organized. This is the creation of Memorial Day during that time period, which actually was created by former slaves. They were the first to hold Decoration Day ceremonies rather than these ladies' memorial associations in the South. By about the 1870s, 1880s, they are working very hard to make men feel better about the fact that they lost the war. So the ways that gender plays into this, these are women who are very much trying to make men feel good about themselves. And so women raised a lot of the money for these statues that went up too. And as we think about how space works and where these are placed, I wish I could show you, for example, a giant statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, which is 6 stories tall, and a man on a horse. Like, this is telling a particular story about who is great in society, who should be revered, at the same time that signs are going up saying colored entrance, white entrance, that's segregation and lynching, and things like convict leasing of primarily African American men are being inscribed into society. So how space functions is very important. Who controls that space? Who gets to tell the stories that are told in that space? And at the same time, telling the story that white women are subordinate to men, but very much their job is to make white men feel good about themselves, but also to stay in their place. White women shouldn't be getting too far out of hand. So with the 19th Amendment in 1920, it's not a surprise that there are also women who are saying we would rather be on a pedestal than be out voting in the streets. We want to keep our particular job. And it's also, this is a time where memorials to faithful slaves are being raised as well. This idea of the mammy or the loyal body servant who served alongside his Confederate master in the war, those are being memorialized as well, because this is a much happier story for most people to tell in the early 20th century. And then again, another peak during the 1950s and 60s, primarily as part of massive resistance to the civil rights movement. So sort of doubling down and saying, we really, really don't want to change the story of the past we're telling. We're going to make it even stronger. That these were heroes, Nathan Bedford Forrest monuments going up in the 1960s, and he was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, like really trying to say, no, this is who we stand for. A lot of the school names came about during that time. So there's also sort of a recent peak beginning in the 1990s. We can imagine also perhaps the election of 2008 has led to a lot of new monuments, giant flags that are flown on private property but can be seen for a very long distance, really trying to reassert this particular story. So I will stop there.
Can you use that same microphone?
I'm going to keep this short so we can get to the good part. So I kind of want to start where I'm coming from with all of this as well. So I'm from Newark, New Jersey. It's a place that a lot of the people who were scarred by the racism and things like that in the South came to during the Great Migrations and things like that. So a lot of the older people that I would talk to and spend time with when I was younger would tell me a lot of stories of things like this, just the aftermath of all the Civil War things we're talking about today. I also kind of wanted to connect with Nash and Smith was saying, and the thing that I was hearing was this, the parallel and the spikes of kind of Black Renaissance and white retaliation. So, Nash spoke on a lot of the things that were going on around that time to keep Black people oppressed. Other things like federal, segregation coming around at that time. We spoke on the Ku Klux and things like that. But a lot of good things for Black people happened at that time. The Urban League was founded around that time. That was a group that just helped Black people get jobs, helped Black people get housing and things like that. And he said NAACP was founded around that time. Fraternities and sororities like Delta Sigma Theta and Omega Psi Phi were founded around those times. So there's always been when the Harlem Renaissance was a little later, but still kind of the same thing. So whenever large communities of Black people have been pulling themselves up, have been getting their things together, trying to make their situation better in America, there's always been a group of white people who are ready to shut that dream down. And that's kind of, when I was hearing about all the Charlottesville things and everything that was going on, that was kind of going through my head. Because now, a friend of mine and I were talking, now we're starting to see a kind of another Black Renaissance, where younger Black people our age are starting to realize a lot of things. We're starting to grow up, we're starting to wake up, we're starting to get out of this stigma that we're supposed to fit in our lives. And, with all of that happening, as we can see, there's also spikes in white retaliation coming back, things like that.
Great, thanks so much. So yeah, I just want to ask one quick question, and then I think we can open up to audience questions. So how does this affect us here in the middle of the Stearns County, Minnesota, a small liberal arts institution?
Well, I think the most obvious way that it affects us is that we have students who are directly affected by things like this. We have a lot of students whose families are directly affected by things like this. There are we don't have many students from a lot of southern states, but we do have students from southern states, which just the salience of things like this in our lives makes it a salient issue on campus. If we are, supposed to be living in community, we're supposed to be living out these Benedictine values, whatever is affecting me in my life should also have some type of salience in your life, just like whatever is affecting you in your life should have some type of salience in my life.
many of the people who pass by these monuments every day or see Confederate flags every day and just think, it doesn't really affect me. I think one thing that all of us could do is realize how this does affect all of us, that these stories and therefore these values are inscribed into our society. And so just trying to identify and realize that there is going to require some action, that it feels like in central Minnesota that maybe we get to just ignore some of these problems, or again say, oh, well, that's in the South, or that's in other places, that is not part of our social fabric, which then just gets back to that same binary that I would say, as though the South is bad, or that only bad people do or think these things. And really, we are swimming in the waters of a society that it was developed by and for white people. We cannot escape that. So really trying to identify and pay attention rather than having the option to just ignore these issues.
From my perspective, I think it's probably extremely relevant. Sometimes when I drive here, I see Confederate flags on bumpers. I've heard a lot of hate speech towards Somali folks since I've been here. And at the same time, I think Mr. Johnson's question is really interesting, because when I was trying to think about what I was going to say, I was wondering, why would it take Charlottesville for us to talk about this? Or why would it take, the massacre in Charleston at the church to have people talk about Confederate flag and its legacy? Then when I thought about it, I thought, actually, maybe I should just look in the mirror, because it took those events for me to talk about this in public. So I think one thing at a school that is predominantly white, something like this should be good. Maybe white folks would want to look in the mirror and wonder, why aren't we talking about this more often? Why would it take a horrendous event to force a reckoning of the past and to understand its influence in the present? So I would hope that events like this might even just be the beginnings of further discussions, and that perhaps we could ask ourselves about our own campus. What cultural norms does it support? Are these cultural norms that are relevant to support here in the present? Are there traditions that we should think about? Are there structures that we should re-examine and reconsider? So I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation, even though some folks, such as myself, are entering it extremely late. And one of the things, every single influence that I quoted for me were black people. James Baldwin was writing about this, in the 60s, earlier. W.E.B. Du Bois writing about it even earlier. Frederick Douglass writing about it even earlier. Ida B. Wells writing about it. I mean, so in a way, I think it's extremely relevant. And the question we should ask is, why do we think it isn't relevant? To me, I mean, that's where I think it's useful to go.
Thanks. So now, do we have a mic to pass around? Okay. If you are ready.
Just speak up.
Yeah, just talk loudly. So do you have any questions? Just raise your hand. Awesome.
What is the primary mode of making a historical narrative? Like, is it made in like films more, or is it made in like political rhetoric, or is it like just the history books that make it, or what's the primary drive?
And then repeat the question in the microphone for the.
Awesome. So.
Whoever answers, I can repeat it.
Thank you. It was a great question. What is the primary mode of creating a historical narrative? Is this done in the movies? Is it done in politics? Or is it just done in history books? Is that a fair summary? Yes, excellent question. So we can see by our example, historical narratives are created in statues. They're created through the use of flags at particular places and times. They're absolutely created through movies. They're created through music. They're created by historians who make arguments and interpretations using evidence from the past. They're done, historical narratives are made and used in politics all the time. I mean, we can think of politicians making speeches using particular symbols in particular places to craft a particular narrative and call out to particular people that they're wanting to contact through that. So, yes, did I misunderstand your question?
A bit. I'm kind of more wondering what is the most prevalent form. So the strongest of the different ways to make historical narrative.
Can I say popular culture in general? So what is the most prevalent way of doing it? For a long time, I would say history books were, because the stories that were told in schools were primarily written in the South, and even today, textbooks in most elementary schools are approved by the state of Texas, and that because that's the biggest money driver for textbook companies. So they want to make sure that their textbooks will be adopted in the state of Texas, and then from there to the rest of the country, which is how we get narratives like workers that were brought from Africa or immigrants that were brought from Africa to labor. No, we mean enslaved people. So history books, I think, are very important, but I'd say popular culture can be just as influential. That movies like Birth of a Nation, the visceral reality of watching that made people for generations think Reconstruction was the worst time ever, slavery was a good thing, black people should have remained as slaves. Gone with the Wind, even today, is still a very potent message that comes through socially, even though most of you haven't seen it unless I coerce you to do it. But we cannot understand sort of this like Southern Belle unless you understand Gone with the Wind. So I'd say popular culture is what reinvents, and as Jaheer said, popular culture is also what, popular culture is also reinventing and telling news stories like the new movie Birth of a Nation about Nat Turner's rebellion. So how popular culture can tell counter narratives and challenge existing narratives, but requires people to watch those things and talk about those things instead of just ignoring those new narratives.
What I would say, kind of what Ms. Smith alluded to, is at least in my experience, supremacy hits you in all angles. So there's not really it hits you where it can. So in any way that it can kind of give you this narrative, it will give you this narrative. So in my experience, it could have been things, like we said, from movies, it could have been in the music, it could have been, in all the other things that we can think of. I'd agree that textbooks are definitely a huge way. There's been a lot of debate on the kind of things that are in textbooks, and what I've been reading lately is mostly debate on the textbooks that are coming out of Texas, because that's like the biggest distributor of textbooks to the public school systems and things like that. And I'd say that is definitely the way we're educated in the school. I definitely say that.
Great. Yes.
Well, just to add to that, there is the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis have made incredibly effective use of the internet. Internet chat rooms, they have their own narratives there about what is going on in the world, and most of us don't go there, don't want to go there, but that's where their own version of history is being generated. People that showed up in Charlottesville, and they had a really strong pull on millennial white males. So these historical narratives, these alt-right narratives, are almost certainly talking to somebody that you know if you're a white male. So I would say I hate even to think about going to those sites and boosting their numbers, but maybe we should be finding out what those narratives are, so we at least know what some of our students and classmates are absorbing.
And just to add, check out, so Steve Bannon, big Trump advisor, just left the White House, used to head up this organization, now he's back there, called Breitbart. Go check out that site. That's sort of a mainstream site now. Look at the comments. You don't have to search too deep to find what Professor Reed's talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, Maya.
What would you say is the largest difference, or the most noticeable difference between white supremacy of the past and white supremacy now?
I think it's hard to say it's very different. They wore khakis instead of hoods. There aren't that many differences. Narratives like that have been mainstream at every point in society we've talked about. So I wouldn't say there are really all that many differences. Often, people during the civil rights movement would also use the same language, saying, well, yes, of course we want equality and we want change, but don't do it too fast. Like, just step back and go slowly. And I mean, I'd say the same things. There might be different messages or ways of communicating that message, whether it's a KKK newsletter that circulated in Minnesota in the 1920s, which had several 100,000 members in Minnesota in the 1920s. It might be the internet today, but I wouldn't say there is a ton of difference, because it's often not seen as white supremacy. Maybe that is another continuity, that it's not called that name, it's just called the story of the past. It's just accepted as the norm rather than being called by a name.
Great. Any other question?
I'd just like to add on to that. Add on to this idea of continuities and white supremacy. Also, when you think about Black protests and the way that is received, that has also never been acceptable. So during the civil rights movement, sit-ins, protests, marches, it was like, well, that's too extreme, that's too much, it's too fast. And now we see the same kind of rhetoric in response to Black Lives Matter, in response to Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem. That's not the right kind of protest. And then there's the question, well, what is the right kind of protest?
Great.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the voice. I definitely agree that voice supremacy now is kind of disguised as people trying to say this is history and the proud of it. With the Confederate flag, people feel like this is history. This is a symbol of South back then. It's not racist at all. It's not us trying to say that we're better, but that's how it's perceived by a lot of people. Confederate flag does represent that time when slavery was acceptable and it's not.
I could talk about the Confederate flag all day, but yes, the comment was that talking about the past or white supremacy is sort of saying, well, we're just being true to the past. We're just honoring our forefathers or whatever, or the whole heritage, not hate argument. Let me assure you, you cannot separate the Confederate flag with the way that the Confederate flag has been used. The United Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1890s would roll over in their graves if they knew that people were wearing t-shirts or flying this on their trucks like that. They saw it as a sacred ceremonial flag. It wasn't until really backlash against the civil rights movement that it became a commonplace use. So you can argue that there is a different history of the flag, but it requires willful ignoring of the way the flag has actually been used in this country. So yes, we can attach different meanings to symbols. Most people are going to see that symbol and see racism attached to it, and if you choose to ignore that, then be aware that people are seeing that, and you cannot separate those. That is not a symbol that should be redeemed in any way.
Yeah, I'm curious because there was recently a New York Times piece on people trying, not necessarily to redeem the symbol, but say, this is my free speech. And so I have a right to free speech, and this goes along with, Milo Yiannopoulos and Breitbart. So how do we understand the right to free speech in a context that also respects other people's rights not to be told they're less than human?
So, what I would say is that there was a talk last year on campus that they talked about free speech, and in that talk they talked about the different types of rights. There's absolute rights and then relative rights, and they made the distinction, and they put free speech on the side of relative rights, meaning that these are rights that you have in relation to everyone else. So an absolute right is something that you get automatically, absolutely. And relative rights are things that you have in relation to, in this case, how they make people feel. So what I would say to this talk about the flag being a part of free speech, I'd say that it is a right, but it's a relative right, meaning that if someone feels that this is something that's impeding on their living, impeding on them being able to survive wherever they are, then that's something that you shouldn't do, something that shouldn't be discussed or talked about.
Yeah, good question. Okay, we have time for one more question. If somebody has something they want to ask. Otherwise, I do have another question. So you're talking about, Professor Smith was talking about space and what symbols mean in space. Could you elaborate on, how these symbols affect the people around them? What role they play in the lives of people who have to walk past these statues every day, things like that?
So this is very interesting. I'm in Matt Lindstrom's urban sustainability class, and we're talking about how space influences people's lives, how where you live influences how you think, how you're perceived, how you grow up, how you look at the world around you. And just based on that, we can definitely see how these monuments would influence people's lives. And we've been talking about it this whole time, how when you see a symbol, that symbol automatically tells you something. And when you see symbols of hatred towards you, you get influenced by that, and you start to think that that's just how things are, that's how things go.
In some ways, for me, I'm thinking similarly to Mr. Jones, in which I think sort of the placement of certain artifacts or monuments or memorials in public spaces, they suggest whose history matters. And then if I'm sticking with my theme that history matters, when I was a kid, I was flattered. I saw a lot of monuments that look like me.
I've been joking with Professor Smith that that's where how I learned how to stand really tall, why I want to learn to ride a horse. But at the same time, as a kid, I didn't realize that perhaps these monuments were just memorializing a segment of history, where I thought it was universal too. So in a way, I think, what we decide to construct a monument to, where we put it, sends a big message. And so in a way, I appreciate that question, because I think that's sort of like where the context is. It suggests who matters in the present based on whose history is taught or whose history is seen, and so on.
Awesome. Well, I think, do you want to wrap it up? Or I can wrap it up. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for coming tonight. It's been really great. I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion. Thanks again to the panelists for coming and sharing their insight. I hope this was really valuable. Thanks.
Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Benny's, if you need to catch the bus, don't feel bad, go ahead. Our next Politics in a Pint will be on November 2nd. We will have 3 different professors talking on gene editing, human gene editing, and whether it should be an acceptable practice in the United States. We hope to see you there. Thank you.